At a grand military funeral for General Richard T. Albbright, the world honors a four-star legend. Beyond the cemetery gates, unnoticed, stands Walt Brener, an 83-year-old Vietnam veteran in a faded uniform, clutching a white lily. Decades ago, Walt risked his life to save Albbright from a collapsing bunker under enemy fire. Now, forgotten by all but the general, Walt seeks only to say goodbye. As dignitaries salute and cameras flash, General McCrae spots him. What happens next stops the ceremony cold, unveiling a hero's hidden past. Will Walt's silent sacrifice finally be recognized? Inspired by Walt Brener's story? Join us in honoring unsung heroes. Like, subscribe, and share to spread their stories. Comment your thoughts. Have you met a quiet hero? Let's keep their legacy alive. Support our channel for more tales of courage and humanity. Thank you for watching. The morning at Quantico was cloaked in a solemn gray, the kind of sky that seemed to hush the world into stillness, as if nature itself knew the weight of the day. American flags lined the paved walkway to the National Cemetery, their edges catching the breeze with soft, whispering flutters, like voices from a distant past. In the background, a brass ensemble tuned their instruments, their notes floating gently, blending with the murmurs of reporters positioning their long lenses under crisp white tents. This was no ordinary farewell. It was the funeral of General Richard T. Albbright, a four-star legend whose strategic brilliance had shaped battlefields across the globe, whose mentorship had molded generations of officers, and whose face had stared out from magazine covers, a symbol of American resolve. Foreign dignitaries stood alongside U.S. officials, their uniforms gleaming with rows of medals, ribbons polished to a mirror-like shine under the muted morning light. Black SUVs lined the road, their tinted windows reflecting the gravity of the moment. The Secretary of Defense was there, flanked by three former generals, and a former president had sent a towering wreath, its ribbons trembling in the wind. This was a goodbye for a titan, a moment where the world paused to honor a man whose name was synonymous with sacrifice. But just beyond the security checkpoint, unnoticed by the flashing cameras and whispering reporters, stood Walt Brener. At 83, he was a shadow of a man in the eyes of the world, his frame thin, his face etched with the lines of a life hard-lived, his faded green uniform fraying at the seams. His boots, polished to a quiet shine, bore the creases of decades, and the unit patch on his shoulder, its colors dulled by time, was the only hint of the life he'd once led. In his weathered hand, trembling slightly, he held a single white lily, carefully wrapped in a worn handkerchief, its delicate petals a stark contrast to the roughness of his skin. Walt stood still, his eyes fixed on the gates that barred him from the ceremony within. The guard's dismissal had been swift. "This is a restricted area, sir. Military funeral, four-star general. No clearance, no entry." The words cut, not because they were harsh, but because they reminded Walt of how the world had moved on, leaving him behind. Yet he didn't protest. He never did. He simply stood, the weight of memory anchoring him, his heart heavy with a grief that ran deeper than the pomp and circumstance beyond the gate. To those who passed him in Owensboro, Kentucky, Walt was just another elderly man, soft-spoken and unremarkable, blending into the rhythm of small-town life. His modest home sat on the edge of town, its porch railing peeling, its flagpole tilting slightly in the wind, yet the stars and stripes flew proudly every day. Neighbors knew him as the man who kept his lawn neat, who offered a polite nod at the corner store, who left food for the stray cats that wandered near his backyard. They didn't see the medals hidden in a drawer, their shine dulled by years of neglect, or the names etched in his memory, comrades whose faces lingered in his dreams, some never honored on any wall. Walt had been a recon sergeant in one of the Vietnam War's most dangerous units, a man who had carried others through enemy fire, his courage forged in moments of chaos and terror. Now he was just an old man, out of place in a world that no longer remembered. When news of General Albright's death reached him, it was as if time stopped. The general's name wasn't just a headline to Walt, it was a tether to a moment that had defined him, a moment he'd buried deep but never forgotten. He didn't call anyone, didn't write letters, didn't seek permission. He simply reached for the letter he'd received 3 years ago, its paper worn from countless readings, its words a quiet reminder of a debt unpaid. He folded it with care, packed a single duffel bag, and began the long journey to Quantico. The trip took nearly a day, a local bus to Louisville, a transfer at a station stuck in 1974, its faded posters and cracked benches a mirror to Walt's own sense of being left behind. The final stretch through Virginia was quiet, the soft rattle of the bus window a steady companion to his thoughts. He carried only his duffel, a battered canteen, and the white lily, cradled like a treasure in its handkerchief. The night before, in a dimly lit motel room, Walt had pressed his old wool uniform, its faint cedar scent a whisper of the past. The brass buttons, shined with a cloth from '68, gleamed softly despite their age. He wore no medals, no ribbons, only the faded unit patch, a silent badge of honor. He expected no recognition, no fanfare. His only purpose was to say goodbye to the man whose life he had saved, to offer a final gesture, and to fade back into the obscurity of his quiet life. But the world has a way of remembering what it has forgotten. Inside the gates, the ceremony unfolded with military precision, cameras flashing, medals glinting, the flag rising slowly for a national hero. General Albright's coffin, draped in the stars and stripes, stood at the heart of it all, surrounded by a sea of uniforms and dignitaries. Then, in the midst of a salute, mid-speech, mid-ceremony, the world paused. The general's successor, a man of unyielding discipline, froze mid-gesture, his eyes catching the lone figure beyond the gate. Without a word, he stepped down from the platform, his boots slicing through the manicured lawn. The crowd fell silent, their confusion palpable. Reporters lowered their microphones, dignitaries shifted. The guards stood motionless, unsure of protocol. The general reached Walt, and for a moment, time held its breath. Their eyes met, a silent conversation woven from shared sacrifice. Then, with a precision that echoed across the cemetery, the general raised his hand in a salute so sharp it seemed to cut the air. It was not for a president, not for a peer, but for Walter Brener, the forgotten hero who had once carried a young Lieutenant Albbright through a storm of bullets, who had risked everything and asked for nothing. Walt's trembling hand returned the salute, the lily quivering in his grip, his eyes glistening with unspoken pride and pain. The crowd watched, breathless, as the world honored not just a legend, but the man who had made that legend possible. In that moment, Walt stood taller, his shoulders squared with the dignity of a soldier who had carried others through fire. He said nothing, his lily spoke for him, a quiet offering for a life saved, a farewell to a bond forged in war. As the general returned to the ceremony, Walt slipped away, his boots silent on the pavement, disappearing into the gray morning as quietly as he had arrived. In the quiet solitude beyond the bustling crowd, an old man stood motionless, his silhouette carved against the restless wind. Walt Brener's frame bore the gentle curve of age, his shoulders slightly hunched under the weight of years. His olive-green uniform, though meticulously pressed, carried the faint bleach of countless suns, its fabric worn thin at the seams. The heels of his boots, cracked and weathered, whispered of long marches across forgotten trails. In one hand, he cradled a single white lily, its delicate petals trembling as if aware of the journey it had endured across state lines. In the other, his calloused fingers curled tightly around the cold iron of the cemetery gate, anchoring him to the moment. A young military policeman stood at the entrance, his eyes barely lifting from the clipboard in his hands. "I'm sorry, sir," the soldier said, his voice clipped with routine authority. "This is a restricted area. Military funeral for a 4-star general. You'll need clearance." Walt's response came soft and steady, like a river worn smooth by time. "I served with him." The guard hesitated, his gaze flickering to the clipboard, searching for a name that wasn't there. "Are you family?" he asked, his tone softening just enough to betray his youth. Walt shook his head, his eyes distant but unwavering. "No, just a friend from long ago." The MP glanced at the growing crowd behind Walt, their murmurs swelling like a tide. He shook his head again, firmer this time. "I'm afraid I can't let you in, sir." Walt didn't protest. He didn't recount the blood-soaked nights he and Albbright had shared, didn't speak of the jungle floor where they'd clung to life together. Instead, he stepped back with a quiet nod, retreating to the side of the gate. His face betrayed no anger, no sorrow, only the stoic resolve of a man who had long since learned to carry his burdens in silence. Inside the cemetery, the ceremony unfolded with measured precision. Trumpets sang their mournful notes, piercing the air. Pallbearers, their white gloves pristine, moved in solemn unison. Dignitaries bowed their heads, their hands clasped in gestures of respect. But beyond the iron fence, Walt stood unnoticed, a solitary figure dwarfed by the grandeur within. Only the wind seemed to acknowledge him, tugging gently at the lily in his hand. He remained there, still as the gravestones that surrounded him, his thoughts drifting to a place no one else could see. The lily quivered, its fragility a stark contrast to the iron grip of his memories. Walt had no place among the honored guests, no name on the polished list, but he had a place in the story, a place etched in sweat, blood, in a bond forged in the crucible of war, a place that belonged to him and the man now resting beneath the neatly folded flag. Half a century earlier, the air in Vietnam's Central Highlands hung heavy, thick with the acrid sting of smoke and the sour tang of fear. Fire-based ripcord crouched like a wound in the lush green hills, its mud-slicked trenches a fragile defense against the jungle's relentless pulse. It was February 1968, and the Tet Offensive had set the country ablaze, every outpost a spark in a powder keg. That night, the sky was a bruised expanse of black, broken only by the fleeting glow of flares and the angry streaks of tracer fire. Mortars had pounded the base all day, their concussive thuds rattling the bones of every soldier within. By nightfall, the jungle was alive with chaos, shouts, sporadic gunfire, and the ominous thump of incoming shells. The men at Ripcord knew they were surrounded, but the true weight of their peril didn't hit until the perimeter radio went dead. In a collapsed bunker near the southern ridge, a young Lieutenant Richard T. Albbright crouched low, his heart pounding against his ribcage. Fresh from West Point, his uniform still carried the crispness of ambition, but his face was streaked with mud and fear. Beside him lay Reynolds, a communications officer barely old enough to shave, his blood seeping into the dirt as he clung to a shattered radio. Albright's M16, its barrel slick with grime, rested in his trembling hands. His ankle throbbed from the blast that had caved in the bunker's roof, each pulse of pain a reminder of how close death loomed. The enemy was closing in, their shadows flickering in the orange glow of gunfire. Albright's mind raced, torn between duty and the raw instinct to survive. He didn't know help was coming. Walt Brener had caught the last garbled transmission before the radio fell silent. His pulse quickened, but his movements were deliberate, honed by years of instinct. Without waiting for orders, he grabbed 2 smoke grenades, a flare, and his M14, its weight of familiar comfort. Then he plunged into the darkness alone. No backup, no hesitation. He moved like a specter, low and swift, navigating craters and tangled underbrush with the grace of a man who'd long made peace with danger. The firefight roared just ahead, its orange flashes painting the night in jagged strokes. Desperate voices cut through the din, and Walt's eyes locked onto the splintered remains of a barrel shack. There, pinned and exposed, were Albbright and Reynolds. Reynolds clutching his useless radio, Albbright firing blindly into the shadows. "You boys look lost," Walt muttered as he slid beside them, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. Before either could respond, he yanked the pins from the smoke grenades and lobbed them toward the tree line. The hiss of smoke filled the air, veiling their position. Time to move. With a strength that belied his lean frame, Walt hauled Reynolds up by the collar, ignoring the boy's pained gasp. He slung Albright's arm over his shoulder, steadying the lieutenant's faltering steps. Then they ran, the world collapsing into a blur of footsteps, adrenaline, and the crack of bullets splitting the air. Smoke curled around them, a fleeting shield against the chaos. Walt's breath came steady, even as shrapnel tore a jagged gash across his shoulder, warm blood soaking his sleeve. He didn't flinch, didn't slow. They broke through the perimeter just as another shell erupted behind them, the shockwave nearly knocking them to the ground. Later, in the dim light of the medic tent, the chaos gave way to quiet. Reynolds, pale but breathing, was stitched up and sent to recover. Albbright, his ankle bound and his limp permanent, stared at the ceiling, grappling with the miracle of his survival. Walt sat apart, his shoulder bandaged, his face unreadable. When the commendation came, a Bronze Star, a ceremony, he waved it off. "I did my job," he said, his voice flat, as if heroism were as routine as tying his boots. He refused the photographs, the speeches, the gratitude. After his final tour, Walt vanished without fanfare, slipping back to Kentucky like a shadow retreating from the light. He left the war behind, or tried to. But Richard Albbright never forgot the man who'd carried him through the smoke, the man who'd asked for nothing in return. Under a sky heavy with the weight of memory, the cemetery stretched out in solemn silence, its rows of white stones standing like sentinels for the fallen. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint echo of a funeral band's rendition of America the Beautiful, now faded into the distance. The ceremony for General Albbright was a spectacle of military precision, a tribute to a man whose name was etched into the annals of strategy and sacrifice. A flag-draped casket rested on a ceremonial platform beneath a canopy, surrounded by officers from every branch of service, their medals glinting in the muted light. Rows of folding chairs held senators, generals, and foreign dignitaries, their faces carved with grief and respect, hands clasped tightly in their laps. The weight of the moment pressed down on every soul present, a shared understanding that this was no ordinary farewell. General Daniel McCrae stood near the center aisle, his tall frame rigid in his dress uniform, the lines of his face etched deep by decades of service. In his late 60s, McCrae was a man of unyielding discipline, decorated for valor and known for his unflinching focus. He had served under Albbright in the scorching deserts of the Middle East, where the general's sharp mind and unshakable resolve had shaped victories from chaos. McCrae's chest ached with the loss of his mentor, a man whose voice still echoed in his mind during moments of doubt. Yet, as the speakers took their turns at the podium and cameras swept gently across the crowd, something pulled McCrae's gaze beyond the heart of the ceremony. Out past the security gate, just beyond the tree line, a lone figure stood motionless, a silhouette against the horizon. McCrae squinted, adjusting the brim of his cap, his heart giving a quiet lurch he couldn't explain. The man was elderly, his posture straight despite the years that had bent others. His uniform, faded but meticulously pressed, bore the unmistakable patch of Recon Battalion, Ghost Company. In one hand he held a single white lily, its delicate petals trembling in the breeze. The sight stirred something deep in McCrae's gut, a pull he couldn't ignore. This wasn't just a veteran paying respects. This was someone tied to Albbright in a way that transcended rank or recognition. McCrae leaned toward the junior officer beside him, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Do you see that man at the gate?" The officer nodded, his brow furrowing. "Sir, he tried to enter earlier. No clearance, said he wasn't family." McCrae's eyes never left the figure. His voice dropped further, heavy with realization. "That's Walt Brener." The name landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the air between them. The junior officer's eyes widened, his breath catching as the weight of the name sank in. Walt Brener, the man who had saved Albright's life all those years ago, under a sky torn apart by fire and ash. McCrae's mind flickered back to the stories, half legend, half whispered truth, passed down through the ranks. A young Albbright, barely a lieutenant, trapped in the mud of a battlefield, his future hanging by a thread, and Walt, a soldier with no thought for glory, who had risked everything to pull him free. That moment had shaped Albright's life, a debt he carried through every promotion, every war, every quiet night when the weight of command pressed too hard. Walt had faded into civilian life, his name buried in classified reports, but Albbright never forgot. Even in his final days, he had left a single instruction: "Let Walt bring me home." He already did once. McCrae's jaw tightened, a surge of resolve cutting through the fog of protocol. He didn't hesitate, didn't consult the master of ceremonies, or glance at the sea of high-ranking brass watching his every move. He simply stepped forward, his polished boots leaving the canopy platform and crossing the immaculate lawn toward the iron gate where Walt stood. The field seemed to hold its breath. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Reporters lowered their microphones, and a photographer froze mid-click, his lens trained on the general's determined stride. This was no scripted moment, no part of the meticulously planned ceremony. McCrae wasn't heading to the podium to deliver a eulogy or to console Albright's family. He was walking away from the heart of the event, toward a man no one had expected to see. The security detail shifted, one guard stepping forward to intercept, but McCrae's raised hand stopped him cold. Walt, unaware of the stir he'd caused, stood as he had before, calm and unyielding, his eyes fixed on the distant casket. The white lily in his hand seemed to glow against the faded green of his uniform, a quiet offering for a man he'd saved decades ago. His face was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of a life lived in the shadows of duty. He had no clearance, no invitation, no place among the senators and generals. Yet he was here, driven by a bond forged in blood, bounded by a memory. In his heart, Walt carried the weight of that day, the screams of the wounded, the heat of the burning sky, and the moment he'd locked eyes with a young officer who had no business surviving. He'd never sought recognition, never expected thanks. But standing here so close to Albright's final resting place, he felt the pull of memory, sharp and unrelenting. McCrae stopped 3 feet from Walt, his posture ramrod straight. He adjusted the hem of his jacket, removed his white gloves with deliberate care, and raised his hand in a full salute, a gesture reserved for commanders, for equals. The motion was crisp, practiced, but heavy with meaning. It was a gesture that spoke. Walt stepped a step forward, confusion flickering across section as the face before he understood. His eyes flashed, the storms backed up with memory flooded back, confusion flooding back his memory. The soldier shook, squared up, shoulders squared, and returned a subtle gesture for his face. Eyes kept a quiet pride he'd never allowed himself to claim. He spoke nothing behind, but his voice a storm pressed into the line with the gratitude of this moment. The soldiers behind the ceremony who'd frozen, stunned faces now, flushed with shame. Their faces flushed, the younger officer's eyes widened with guilt. Crowd began to piece together, stories began to spread like wildfire, carried by wildfire. Those who knew fragments whispered the name of Walt. He wasn't just a soldier, not just a face, he was another reason. A soldier was the reason why. As McCrae stood beside him silently and in, the moment, honoring this quiet, honored, would linger long after all than words. The cemetery gate stood cold and iron-wrought, a silent sentinel under the gray, heavy sky. McCrae, his shoulders rigid in his starched uniform, lingered beside Walt, both men caught in the echo of a moment too profound for words. The rifle salute had long since faded, its sharp cracks swallowed by the stillness. Yet the air clung to a somber weight, thick as morning fog rolling over a battlefield. Behind them, the funeral procession, once a flurry of motion and murmured respects, had settled into a sacred pause. Mourners stood frozen, their breaths barely stirring the air. Soldiers, young and old, bowed their heads, their polished boots rooted to the earth. Reporters, usually ravenous for a story, let their cameras hang forgotten at their sides, sensing that this was no moment for intrusion. The ceremony had halted, yet no one stirred, no one dared break the reverence that wrapped them all. McCrae's gaze shifted to his aide, a young man standing just beyond the crowd, his face pale with the gravity of his task. The aide stepped forward, his movements deliberate, almost hesitant, as though the ground might give way beneath him. In his gloved hands, he cradled a polished mahogany box, its deep, rich wood gleaming faintly under the overcast light. Brass trim caught the dim glow, giving the box an aura of quiet nobility. It was small, unassuming, yet the aide held it with a reverence that suggested it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. His eyes met McCrae's, and with a silent nod, he offered the box to the general. McCrae's hands, steady from years of command, accepted the box with a care that betrayed the storm of emotions beneath his composed exterior. His fingers brushed the smooth wood, and for a fleeting moment, his breath caught, as if the box held not just ashes, but the very soul of the man it honored. He turned to Walt, who stood beside him, his weathered face etched with lines that spoke of a life carved by hardship and sacrifice. "For you, Walt," McCrae said, his voice low, threaded with a rawness that formality couldn't mask. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning Walt couldn't yet grasp. Walt's eyes dropped to the box, confusion flickering across his features like ripples on a still pond. His lips parted, but no sound came at first. Me? He finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper, as though the question itself was too fragile to bear. McCrae's gaze softened, his eyes holding Walt's with an intensity that seemed to reach back through decades. General Albbright left a final directive, he said, each word measured, deliberate. He insisted that you, and only you, be the one to carry him home. The words landed like a blow and Walt's breath hitched, his hand trembling as he reached out. You already did once, McCrae added, his voice quieter now, almost tender. The memory those words summoned struck Walt with a force that made his knees falter. His mind reeled, pulling him back to a time of smoke and case, of blood-soaked fields, and the weight of a wounded man slung across his shoulders. His fingers, gnarled by age, hovered over the box before finally settling on its surface. The wood was warm, impossibly so, as if it had absorbed the life of the man it now held. Walt's grip tightened, gentle but firm, the way he might have held a comrade's flag, folded tight with grief and honor. His throat worked, but no words came. A single tear traced the deep creases of his cheek, catching the faint light before it fell. He made no move to brush it away, letting it linger as a quiet testament to the ache in his chest. I thought, Walt's voice cracked, barely audible, his eyes still locked on the box as if it might vanish if he looked away. I thought I was forgotten. The confession slipped out, raw and unguarded, a wound laid bare after decades of silence. McCrae's expression softened further, the stern lines of his face giving way to something almost paternal. You were never forgotten, Sergeant, he said, the old rank rolling off his tongue with a reverence that made Walt's heart stutter. Just hard to find. The words were a lifeline, pulling Walt from the shadows of his own doubt. A faint chuckle escaped Walt, more a puff of breath than sound, brittle with disbelief. Guess I didn't leave much of a trail, he murmured, his voice thick with the weight of years spent in obscurity. McCrae's eyes crinkled at the faintest hint of a smile, though his tone remained steady. You left the only trail that ever mattered, he said. You left it in the people you saved. The words settled over Walt like a mantle, heavy but warm, and for a moment the silence that followed was profound, as if the world itself had stilled to honor it. Even the trees, their leaves whispering faintly in the breeze, seemed to pause in respect. Walt's eyes lifted, slow and searching, to the crowd beyond McCrae's shoulder. For the first time, he truly saw them, not just as a blur of faces, but as individuals. Each carried their own weight of recognition. Generals with chests full of ribbons, lieutenants barely old enough to shave, civilians clutching tissues or standing awkwardly. Unsure of protocol, they all looked at him. Not with pity, not with curiosity, but with something deeper, something that transcended rank or status. Some nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of his presence. Others saluted, their hands snapping up with crisp precision. A few simply held their breath, their eyes glassy, as if they understood that this moment carried a significance no speech could capture. McCrae stepped aside, his movement subtle but purposeful, and gestured toward the long gravel path that stretched from the gate to the platform where the flag-draped display still stood, a silent sentinel of its own. Go, Walt said, his voice soft but resolute, carrying the weight of a command given with love. Walt's gaze lingered on the path, its length stretching out before him like a bridge across time. It wasn't far in distance, but in memory it was a chasm, a lifetime of battles fought, comrades lost, and a duty that had never wavered. He drew a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort of it, and squared his shoulders, the posture of a soldier returning to the field. His first step crunched against the gravel, a sound that echoed like a heartbeat in the reverent hush. The crowd parted as he moved forward, a quiet tide of faces drawing back to clear his way. No camera lifted, no phone flashed. The world seemed to hold its breath as Walt, this quiet man, this forgotten hero, carried the box with a strength that belied his years. His steps were steady, deliberate, as though each one was a vow renewed. As he passed the ranks of soldiers, hands rose in silent salutes, crisp and unwavering. Hats were lifted, held high by civilians who didn't know the protocol but felt the moment's call. No anthem swelled, no drums rolled, yet the air thrummed with a weight heavier than any military fanfare could summon. Walt's thoughts churned as he walked, a tangle of grief, pride, and disbelief. He had never sought glory, never craved the spotlight that now seemed to follow him. All he had ever wanted was to do his duty, to bring his men home to survive. Yet here he was, called back from the edges of history to carry one last burden, one last honor. The box in his arms felt like both a gift and a weight, a reminder that someone had remembered. Not the soldier, not the rank, but the man. And that, in the end, it was enough. The platform loomed ahead and Walt reached it, his steps slowing as he placed the box with infinite care beside the flag. He lingered there, his fingers brushing the wood one final time, as if to say farewell not just to a general, but to a part of himself that had been buried too long. The ceremony ended, the mournful notes of taps drifting into the sky like a prayer, fading into the clouds. The crowd dispersed, officials retreating to their duties, reporters ushered away with firm but respectful requests for privacy. Walt found himself alone at last, seated on a weathered bench beneath a towering sycamore at the cemetery's edge. The mahogany box rested beside him, cradled in the crook of his arm, as though he couldn't bear to let it go. The world had moved on, the platform cleared, the air quiet save for the soft rustle of leaves overhead. He sat there, lost in thought, his heart a battlefield of gratitude and grief. McCrae appeared one final time, his footsteps soft against the gravel. He said nothing, his silence a gift in itself. In his hand was a cream-colored envelope, its edges yellowed with age, addressed in a neat, deliberate script. To Sergeant Walter Brener. He handed it to Walt with a nod, then turned and walked away, leaving Walt alone with the past and the present, bound together by a memory that would carry forever. Walt stood alone in the quiet room, the letter in his hands trembling slightly, not from age but from the weight of what it held. Its instructions were clear, to be opened only on the day General Richard T. Albbright was laid to rest. His fingers, rough and calloused from years of labor and war, traced the edges of the envelope, as if they might dissolve under his touch. He hesitated, his breath catching in his chest. What could Richard have left unsaid after all these years? The two men hadn't spoken since that night in the mud, a night Walt had buried deep in his mind, like a wound too raw to touch. Slowly he broke the seal, his heart pounding as if he were stepping back into the chaos of battle. Inside was a single sheet, folded twice unadorned. No crest, no formality, just the raw, unfiltered voice of a man who knew his time was running out. As Walt began to read, the words pulled him into a place he hadn't visited in decades. Frank, the letter began, I never thanked you, not the way you deserved. Walt's throat tightened. He could almost hear Richard's voice, steady but heavy with regret. Men like us don't do well with words or moments like that, do we? We let them slip by, thinking there'll always be another chance. But I'm out of chances now, so I'll say it plain. You saved my life, not just mine. Reynolds, too. You didn't ask for a medal, a pat on the back, or even a nod of thanks. You just vanished, like none of it meant a damn thing. But it meant everything to me. Walt's eyes stung as he read on, each sentence unraveling a part of him he'd kept locked away. Richard wrote of that night, a night of fire and blood, when Walt had dragged him and Reynolds through the mire, bullets tearing through the air, their screams drowned out by the roar of war. Walt hadn't thought twice, he just acted, his body moving on instinct, his mind numb to fear. But for Richard, that night was the cornerstone of his life. Because of you, the letter continued, I got to live. I commanded battalions, mentored young soldiers, built a family. I stood on stages, shook hands with presidents, wore medals I never felt I earned. But none of it, not the rank, not the speeches, not the honors, came close to what you did that night. Walt paused, his hands shaking now. He set the letter down for a moment, staring at the floor, his mind flooded with memories he'd spent years running from. He saw Richard's face, young and bloodied, his eyes wide with terror. He felt the weight of Reynolds' limp body slung over his shoulder, the slick mud pulling at his boots, the deafening crack of gunfire. He'd never thought of himself as a hero. He'd just done what needed doing and then walked away, fading into a life of quiet anonymity. But Richard hadn't forgotten. "I've tried to repay you in my own way," the letter went on. "Not with words, but with action. And now, as I face the end, I want to leave you with one final thank you." Walt's breath hitched as he read about the legacy Richard had built in his name. "When they lay me to rest, they'll talk about my career, my medals, my life. But I've asked them to speak your name too. I've established the Walter Brener Center for Healing and Honor. It's not just a name on a wall, Walt. It's a real place, funded by my estate, approved by General McCrae himself. A sanctuary for veterans like us, the ones who carry wounds no one can see, PTSD, trauma, the silence we bury ourselves in. There'll be woodworking shops, therapy rooms, gardens named for the brothers we lost. Every brick will hold the weight of what you did, not just for me, but for all of us who never had the guts to say it out loud." The words blurred as tears welled in Walt's eyes. He didn't wipe them away, he let them fall, each one carrying years of unspoken pain, of feeling like a ghost in a world that had moved on without him. Richard's final line struck him like a blow. "I wanted them to know your name, because honor shouldn't fade with time. And now it won't. Thank you, Sergeant, for my life, for your silence, for your strength. If there's any justice left, maybe one day they'll say my name beside yours, Richard." Walt sat in silence, the letter still in his hands, its words seared into his soul. He felt Richard's presence in the room, not as a general, but as the young man he'd pulled from death's grasp. For the first time in years, Walt didn't feel invisible. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket, close to his heart. Outside, the crunch of gravel broke the stillness. A group of younger veterans stood nearby, their eyes fixed on him with a mix of curiosity and reverence. One stepped forward, his voice soft but clear. "You're him, aren't you? The one they named the center after?" Walt nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I am." The words felt strange, like they belonged to someone else. But as he spoke, a weight lifted. And for the first time in decades, he didn't feel like he was fading away. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Walt had ever experienced. The air was thick with a silence that wasn't just quiet, it was holy, as if the world itself was paying its respects. General McCrae gave a subtle nod, and a ceremonial officer stepped forward to lift the mahogany box containing Richard's ashes. Walt placed a steadying hand on it, his fingers brushing the polished wood, feeling the finality of the moment. Together they began the slow walk across the field toward the canopy, the path stretching out like a thread through time. On either side, rows of chairs held generals, admirals, dignitaries, and families of the fallen, their uniforms glinting under a sky heavy with clouds. The faint clink of metals rose with each gust of wind, a quiet chorus of honor. As Walt walked, something extraordinary happened. A young Marine at the end of the front row stood, his posture rigid, his hands snapping into a crisp salute. Then another followed, and another, until the entire path was lined with soldiers, old and young, decorated and new, standing in tribute. Walt's chest tightened. He knew they saluted Richard, the general whose ashes he carried, but there was something else in their eyes, something meant for him. Whispers rippled through the crowd, soft but heavy with awe. "That's him, the man from Ripcord. He pulled the general out single-handedly. I thought he was long gone." The words weren't meant for Walt, but they reached him anyway, each one landing like a stone in still water. He kept his eyes forward, his steps steady, but inside, he was reeling. For years he'd lived in the shadows, convinced his actions had been forgotten, that his life had been reduced to a footnote. But here, in this sacred moment, he was seen, not as a ghost, but as a man whose courage had rippled through time, touching lives he'd never known. When they reached the canopy, Walt stood tall, the box still in his hands, Richard's legacy intertwined with his own. The ceremony unfolded around him, but his mind lingered on the letter, on the center picture that bore his name, on the gardens and workshops that would heal others as he'd never been healed. For the first time, Walt felt a flicker of peace, not just for Richard, but for himself. And as the final words of the ceremony faded into the wind, he knew that in some small way, He'd found his place in the world again. For 50 years, Walt Brener had lived in the quiet embrace of solitude, his heart unburdened by the need for applause or acknowledgement. His days had unfolded in the stillness of routine, each one a testament to a choice made long ago, to serve without expectation, to fade into the background of a world that moved on. Yet now, on this crisp morning, heavy with meaning, he walked a path lined with reverence, an honor guard of memory standing sentinel on either side. Each step he took was measured, deliberate, as if the ground itself demanded care. In his arms, he cradled an urn, its polished wood warm against his calloused hands, and his back remained as unyielding as it had been half a century ago on a battlefield swallowed by time. The canopy ahead loomed closer, its shadow a quiet invitation, while behind it a flag hung motionless, its edges still as though even the wind held its breath in deference to the moment. Walt's face betrayed nothing, no smile, no nod, no glance to the hundreds of eyes tracing his every move. His world had narrowed to the weight in his arms and the steady rhythm of his boots against the earth. The crowd, a sea of faces blurred by purpose, seemed to fade into the periphery of his mind. He didn't need their gazes to know they were there. He felt the weight of their respect, their unspoken understanding, pressing gently against the silence he'd long called home. His thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the man whose ashes he carried. Not just a general, but a life, a story, a debt repaid in this final act of duty. Walt's chest tightened, not with grief, but with the ache of a memory that refused to dull. The chaos of war, the mud that clung to their boots, the fleeting glance of gratitude from a man he'd pulled from the walls of death. At the center of the platform, General McCrae stepped aside with a gentle nod, his eyes catching Walt's for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement that carried the weight of decades. His weathered face, lined with the burdens of command, softened briefly, as if to say, "You've carried him far enough." The podium nearby stood empty, its polished wood gleaming under the muted sunlight, unnecessary in a moment that needed no words. The honor guard, rigid and resolute, flanked the casket stand, their faces carved with discipline and a quiet. He felt a sense of pride. They were young, their eyes steady, yet Walt knew they understood the gravity of what this day held. Walt ascended the platform alone, his boots echoing faintly in the stillness, a soft cadence that seemed to him to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth. As he turned, the sight before him struck like a quiet thunderclap. His heart stumbled, caught off guard by the overwhelming tide of recognition he'd never sought. The entire cemetery had risen to its feet, not just those near the platform, but every soul, groundskeepers leaning on their rakes, their faces etched with quiet dignity. Drivers paused beside their vehicles, caps in hand. Civilians standing with hand pressed to their hearts their eyes bright with tears. Veterans, old and gray, raising trembling salutes with a pride that refused to fade. No one reached for a phone or a camera. Their hands stayed still, unyielding, as if to capture this moment would be to dilute its sanctity. No voice dared to shatter the sacred hush. Silence, the silence unbroken. The only sound was the faint rustling of starched uniforms and the ghostly echo of a long-forgotten soldier's footsteps, trudging through the mud-soaked fields of a battlefield lost to time. Walt's knees trembled, not from the weight of age, but from the sheer force of that unspoken unity. His throat tightened as he approached the pedestal, the urn in his arms suddenly heavier, as if it held not just ashes, but the sum of a man's unspoken promises. He set it down with care, his movements reverent, as though placing a fragile piece of his own soul on the velvet-draped table. His rough fingers lingered on the urn, tracing the smooth grain of the wood as if to memorize its warmth, to hold on to the moment before it slipped away. For a heartbeat, he stood there, his mind a kaleidoscope of images. Flashes of the general's weary smile, the smoke curling through a war-torn skisitostin, the weight of a rifle in his hands, the long, quiet years of silence that had followed. Then, with a slow, deliberate exhale, he exhaled slowly and stepped back, his heart steadying under the weight of duty fulfilled. At that precise moment, a gentle breeze stirring, lifting the flag's edge like a sigh from the earth itself. The silence deepened, not heavy or cold, but alive, a sacred space where every heartbeat seemed to sink. It was not cold or heavy, not awkward, but sacred, a living, breathing silence that bound every soul in its embrace. Walt stood tall, his silhouette framed by the canopy's shadow, his eyes fixed on the urn, a knowing he had carried not just a man's remains but a legacy into this light moment of a nation finally watching. His heart swelled with a quiet pride, not for himself, but for the man he'd once saved, for the lives they'd touched, for the unspoken bond now laid bare before a world that finally paused to see. Weeks later, in the gentle golden glow of an autumn afternoon in Lexington, Kentucky, a new kind of monument stood quietly at the edge of a sprawling park, a quiet testament to resilience. The Walter Brener Center for Healing and Honor Center was understated in its design, its clean brick walls and wide, light-filled windows radiating a quiet strength, free from the pomp of grand monuments. A simple bronze plaque by the front steps bore its name and its mission, a tribute to silent service, a sanctuary dedicated to those who carried invisible scars. It was not a place of towering pillars or marble arches, but a haven built with purpose, its modesty a reflection of the lives it sought to honor. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew a small, humble crowd, veterans with weathered faces, faces etched with stories untold, families clutching hands, their eyes bright with hope, a handful of local officials who spoke in murmurs of respect. There were no press vans, no blaring trumpets, no fanfare, just a gathering of souls who understood the center's quiet power. Inside, the building was a sanctuary of intention. Therapy rooms painted in soothing earth tones, soft greens, warm beiges, were and shielded by soundproof walls, offered a safe space for minds wrestling with war's echoes. The scent of cedar and faint lavender hung in the air, a subtle balm for frayed nerves. A woodworking shop hummed with possibility. Its benches lined with tools waiting to be wielded by hands seeking purpose in creation. Hands that could shape raw wood into something solid, something real. A reading room, its walls lined with shelves of books, journals, and faded letters from conflicts long past. Yellowed pages from Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, invited quiet reflection, a place to lose oneself in the stories of others. Outside, a courtyard garden wove a gentle path around a small memorial fountain, its soft ripples a soothing counterpoint to the rustling trees overhead. Stone benches, each etched with the name of an unsung soldier, a private, a corporal, a sergeant, stood as silent witnesses to stories left untold, their surfaces worn smooth by time and touch. The dedication ceremony was simple, its words chosen with care. General McCrae stood before the crowd, his shoulders squared, his voice steady but threaded with a quiet emotion that caught in his throat. His eyes, lined with the weight of years, softened as he spoke of men like Walt, soldiers who gave everything and asked for nothing, who slipped back into civilian life without parades or fanfare, carrying wounds no one could see. He paused, his gaze drifting to the crowd, as if searching for the man whose name this place bore. This center, he said, his voice low but resolute, is not about medals or parades. It's about remembrance, about giving back to those who carry scars we'll never see, about offering a place where they can heal without ever needing to explain themselves. His words landed softly, a quiet vow to those who had been overlooked for too long. The ribbon fell, and applause rose, soft, restrained, reverent. Then the doors swung open, welcoming the first visitors into a space that felt like home. But Walt Brener was not among them. He sat across the street on a weathered wooden bench beneath a towering oak, its leaves whispering secrets in the breeze. His cap was pulled low, shielding his face, his hands folded in his lap, a thermos of black coffee steaming faintly beside him. His eyes, sharp despite his years, followed the crowd as they moved toward the center, their steps slow and purposeful. He felt no pull to join them, no urge to stand in the doorway of a building that bore his name, no need to claim a moment that wasn't his. His heart was full, heavy with a quiet pride, not of recognition, but of a man who'd done what was right, not for glory, but because it was his to do. His thoughts drifted to the general, to the urn, to the weight he'd carried, to the silence that had defined him for so long. It was enough, he thought, to know the center stood, to know that others would find peace there, to know his duty was done. As the crowd thinned, a few veterans passed by, their boots scuffing the pavement. Their eyes caught his lingering a moment, recognizing something in the way he sat, still, unassuming, yet unyielding. They sensed the weight of a shared history, the unspoken bond of those who'd been there, who knew. They nodded, a subtle gesture, not out of words but necessity, and Walt nodded back, his lips curving ever so slightly in a gesture that said everything. His eyes returned to the center across the street, its windows glowing warmly in the fading light, and he took a slow sip of coffee, content to keep their shared silence unbroken. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden rays across the sidewalk, painting the world in hues of amber and shadow. Walt sat on the weathered bench outside the newly opened Walter Brener Center for Healing and Honor, his calloused hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The ceremony had just ended, the crowd of well-dressed guests dispersing, their voices fading into the hum of the city. He didn't need to be inside those polished walls, didn't need a podium or a microphone to feel the weight of what had just happened. The center, his center, though he'd never call it that, stood as a testament to something deeper, something he'd carried in his chest for decades. It was a place born from silence, from the unspoken pain of those who'd served in return to a world that didn't always know how to welcome them back. It was a sanctuary for the forgotten, a beacon for healing, built not just of wood and stone, but of memories, grit, and a stubborn kind of hope. As the last of the guests slipped through the glass doors, Walt leaned back, his broad shoulders sinking into the bench's worn slats. His eyes drifted upward to the clouds, soft and fleeting against the endless sky. There was no smile on his lined face, no outward sign of pride or satisfaction. He didn't need one. The center was more than a building. It was the continuation of his story, etched into the very grain of its walls. It was a promise kept to those who'd walked beside him in the chaos of war and to those still wandering in its aftermath. The weight of that promise settled over him, heavy but comforting, like an old coat worn through too many winters. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the bitterness grounding him, and let the moment linger. Across the street, life moved on in its quiet, unassuming way. The city pulsed with its usual rhythm, cars humming, pedestrians weaving through their routines. Walt's gaze shifted to the bus stop a few yards away, where his worn boots rested firmly on the cracked concrete. His coat, buttoned against the evening chill, hung loosely on his sturdy frame. He was a man who carried his years not in complaints, but in the steady way he stood, as if the ground itself owed him something for all it had witnessed. Then, the low rumble of an approaching bus broke the stillness, its brakes hissing as it slowed to a stop. Walt's eyes caught on a figure beside him, a younger man, perhaps in his mid-40s, standing at the edge of the curb. The man's face was etched with a weariness that went beyond fatigue. His eyes, hollow and distant, seemed to look through the world rather than at it. A slight limp in his left leg betrayed an old injury, one that hadn't fully healed, and a heavy duffel bag slung over his shoulder pulled at his frame, threatening to unbalance him. He wasn't lost in the sense of not knowing where he was going. It was something deeper, a disorientation of the soul. Walt recognized it immediately, the look of a soldier who had come home but hadn't yet found his way back to himself. The man's hands fumbled with the bag, his fingers trembling slightly, not from cold but from the weight of carrying too much for too long. Walt didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his boots scuffing softly against the pavement, and reached for the heavier end of the bag. "Let me," he said, his voice low but steady, the kind of tone that didn't invite argument. The younger man blinked, startled, his eyes meeting Walt's for the first time. There was a flicker of surprise, then a nod, small, almost imperceptible, but enough. Gratitude didn't need words. Together they climbed the steps of the bus, the weight of the duffel shared between them. As the doors hissed shut, the world outside seemed to pause. The bench where Walt had sat moments before stood empty now, bathed in the soft glow of late daylight. The leaves above rustled in the breeze, their golden edges catching the sun, whispering of time and resilience. Some heroes, Walt knew, carried their battles long after the gunfire faded. They didn't wear medals or demand recognition. They simply kept moving forward, one step at a time, helping others find their footing when the ground felt unsteady. Inside the bus, the air was warm and faintly stale, the hum of the engine a steady undercurrent to the quiet. The younger man took a seat by the window, his duffel now resting at his feet, no longer a burden. He stared out at the passing trees, their branches blurring into streaks of green and gold. His hands rested in his lap, still but tense, as if he were waiting for something, a memory, a feeling, a reason to keep going. Walt settled beside him, his broad frame filling the seat. He didn't look at the younger man, didn't press him with questions or platitudes. Instead, he gazed ahead, his eyes tracing the familiar rhythm of the city's streets. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that held answers, the kind that said more than words ever could. Walt's mind wandered, not to the ceremony or the center, but to the years that had shaped him. He thought of the faces he'd known, comrades who'd laughed with him, fought with him, and sometimes didn't make it back. He thought of the ones who did return, only to find themselves strangers in their own lives. He'd been one of them once, carrying wounds no one could see, questions no one could answer. But he'd found his way, not through speeches or parades, but through small, deliberate acts, listening to a stranger's story, sharing a burden, offering a moment of understanding. That was what the center was for, what his life had been for, to light the way for those still searching. The younger man shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing against the window. His eyes were still fixed outside, but there was a subtle change in his posture, a loosening of the tension that had gripped him. He didn't know Walt's story, didn't know about the center or the decades of quiet service that had led to this moment, but he felt something, a steadiness, a reassurance that came not from words but from presence. Walt's silence was a gift, a space where the younger man could breathe, could begin to untangle the knots in his mind. They didn't need to speak. They were just two men, one carrying questions, the other carrying answers forged in years of walking through the dark. As the bus rolled on, the city faded into the dusky light, the horizon swallowing the last of the sun's warmth. The Walt Brener Center stood behind them, its walls glowing faintly under the streetlights, a symbol of something enduring. It wasn't just a building, it was a reminder that honor doesn't fade with time, that true service doesn't end when the uniform is hung up. Walt had never worn his medals, never sought the spotlight. His strength was in the quiet moments, the shared weight of a duffel bag, the unspoken understanding between two strangers on a bus. He was a man who shaped lives without fanfare, who carried the stories of others in his silence. In a world that seemed to move faster with each passing day, Walt's story was a call to pause, to notice. How many heroes walk among us, their courage hidden in plain sight? How many lives are touched by a single act of kindness, a moment of compassion offered without expectation? The center was more than a place for veterans. It was a challenge to everyone, to see the unseen, to honor the forgotten, to choose empathy over indifference. Walt's legacy wasn't in the stone or the wood of the building that bore his name. It was in the way he lived, in the way he reached out, one person at a time. As the bus disappeared into the twilight, the world grew still. The bench under the tree stood empty, its surface worn smooth by years of quiet moments. Somewhere in the fading light, Walt's story lived on, not in applause or recognition, but in the steady, unspoken promise of a man who knew that heroes don't always wear stars. Some just light the way home, one step at a time, in honor of those who were never recognized but never forgotten.